Welcome, Sega fans, to the podcast that is the home of innovation. Not that we innovate ourselves, we leave that to Sega, and then we just talk about it. I'm Dan the Mega Driver, here with my co-host, James the SEGAHolic. How you doing?
Very good, mate. Very good.
And joining us today, our good friend, Sega Lord X. Mel, how are you doing, mate?
I'm doing awesome, dude. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you on, as always. Seeing the channel being very busy at the moment, so everything seems to be really kicking off on your side, as always. It's obviously the place where most of us always go for our Sega content, and you know, the Shinobi video, I haven't had a chance to watch it myself yet, as it stands. Just been preparing to go away the last couple of days, but that one I felt like it requires special attention, so I'm going to wait till we've got to our cottage away and make sure I watch that properly.
Yeah, it was awesome having Sega come forward and ask to sponsor a video of mine, and that was like the ultimate pat on the back. It was like, good job, we want you to spearhead bringing Shinobi back, and I'm just like, I'm totally there, let's make it happen, please don't fuck the game up.
Please tell me that's how the discussion went.
Oh, I had some things to say, but I wasn't quite that blunt.
Oh, superb.
It's interesting because Sega are in the have been in the news a lot like recently. They had a big presence on the Nintendo Switch 2. Little bit miffed that Yakuza, whatever the remake is called, or the up-res version, Zero is a Switch exclusive. Probably costs about 90 quid or whatever Switch 2 games go for these days. Have you seen all the Switch 2 reveal, Mel?
I've seen a bit of it, and when they announced the price, I was like, whoa, maybe you guys should have released a, successor to this thing a few years ago, like maybe 8 years was too long. I can't believe that Nintendo has the balls to release a handheld for that kind of money, and then they want to charge you $80 for the games, man. Like, okay, it'll be interesting to see if they can find a market for that, but just from my perspective, there's no way in hell I'm gonna spend that kind of money on a Switch, or a Switch 2. I bought a Switch, the first one when it came out, but it was considerably cheaper than this new one, and I don't know, man. I'm not sure Nintendo is releasing the right product at the right time.
Yeah, I think
Hands
so.
up if you bought your daughter a OLED Switch for Christmas. who knew Switch 2 was coming this year, but had to bite the bullet and get it anyway?
Well,
that's painful.
well, the thing is, I don't know if you've seen some of the carts where they're talking about the upgrades, so you can get Breath of the Wild, and then you can say, oh, well, I want the Switch 2 version, which plays at ultra high resolutions and 120 frames per second. But when you buy the box with the Switch 2 logo on, it's just the original Nintendo Switch cart. You put it in the Switch 2 and it downloads the patch with the code that you've got in the back.
Come on.
Seriously?
That's apparently what a Nintendo UK rep said.
Oh,
But
man.
they aren't going to charge like the new price for it, are they?
They're going to charge the Switch 2 price, but you get the Switch 1 cart in the box with a code.
Yeah, that ain't going to fly, man. Because people will just go to like second-hand places and just buy like a copy of Breath of the Wild or whatever, and then no.
It's this dishonest, because you're not getting a Switch 2 version on the cart. You're getting the Switch 1 version. It's just diabolical.
What happens if you don't have the internet or something? If you live out in the middle of bumfucked Egypt, what the hell what are you supposed to do? You're gonna get the game and it's just gonna, be the original Switch version for $80?
Yeah, yeah. You think you're getting the Switch 2 version and you're not. But then there's games. They've got these game cards where you only get kind of a token to download the game on the card. It's kind of like a lot of discs on Xbox and PS5 and PS4 now.
Game cards or something into it. It initiates a download, but you've got to have this like zombie cartridge in your machine to just like authenticate that the download has been paid for. It's like, oh, come on, man. That's what I said in the last show we recorded, mate. It's like, why do these companies, right? And they've all done it. They win a generation, right? And then they get so cocky and go, we can get away with some outlandish shit here, and then just decide we'll just fucking ruin the whole thing and just try and rip people off. Like, you have the successful business model. Just repeat what you're doing now and make it more powerful.
Yeah, it's had shades of John Matrick with Xbox One, that whole presentation, and the PS3
we have a product for people who don't have internet. It's called Xbox 360.
And of course,
remember that? Jeez.
Yeah. And of course, Sega were just as bad with their hubris after the Mega Drive and Genesis. But,
man,
there we go. And aside from the Switch 2 news, obviously, the other news Sega related in there was that Shenmue was voted the most innovative game of all time. So obviously, this was a public vote. I think with some media people that had insights onto what the most innovative game of all time was. So BAFTA published this. At first, I thought it was like a panel of experts that decided it. I didn't realize it wasn't clear that it's a public vote until you kind of go into the story. But it was an interesting choice. Now, I'm someone, we've talked about Shenmue a lot. We had the podcast recently, didn't we, James? I'm a fan of Shenmue. Most innovative game though, I wasn't sure. But Mel, what was your thoughts when you saw Shenmue as the most innovative game of all time?
Well, when I first saw it, the first thought I had was the sheer amount of Nintendo journalists that are going to shit on that is going to be massive. And I instantly thought about the Nintendo kiddies that run places like IGN and shit. I bet you anything they were going to have something negative to say. And I was not disappointed. The 20-year-olds that run that place that grew up on the Game Boys and the DSs, they have no idea, of real, video game history. So they were probably going to have something smarmy to say about it. And sure enough, they did. You're not even going to know what the game was. Ha, ha, ha. It's like, you dumbass. Like, who has been in gaming for any length of time that doesn't know, what that game is, or at the very least has heard of it? Now, most innovative game ever. I kind of agree with you. I'm not so sure it's the most innovative game ever. That's a big question, and that's a huge answer to have to go over because, video games are different genres. They've had different eras where certain genres have dominated. Just one game that influences the most amount of games, that's a tough one to answer. And yeah, I'm not so sure. Even among just Sega's properties, Sega has likely had more influential games than, Shenmue.
Yeah, I completely agree. You see, I like Shenmue, and I do think that it innovated and had a big influence across the board. You can see it, particularly in kind of modern games. And maybe if you're just looking through it in a modern game lens, you can make a case for it. If it was kind of top 5 in that whole thing, I wouldn't have too much of a problem. I mean, it had Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 and Baldur's Gate in that list. And it's just like, oh my God, who put this together?
Yeah, you knew that was just a bunch of assholes sitting around like, I'm going to pick my favorite game. That's exactly what that was, man.
Yeah, I got into some because I put a tweet out and I was just like, I'm glad to see Sega and Shenmue get their flowers. Most innovative game, I think, is probably a stretch. Someone came into my comments all angry, and I was like, look, it's a popularity vote. It's why you can't base this thing on popularity if you're saying it's the most influential. Like,
no, you can't.
but I thought, obviously today's topic, I thought we'd all talk about the most influential Sega games, the Sega games that truly innovated and had influence across the board. Because, there are a lot. And I think it's fair to say that Sega's influence across the industry is pretty understated. I think you'd both agree. I mean, James, you'd agree for one, wouldn't you?
Oh, aye, 100%, mate. I mean, just to kind of touch on the Shenmue getting the awards, as you said, it's a public vote, right? I had no idea that it was going on. Not that the Sega guys or Sega Lord X are going to sway the vote massively. It's still three votes at the end of the day. But aye, it's kind of the way what I've seen is it's the way that it's been taken very officially by a lot of people. It's like you have to remember what this is. It's essentially a glorified internet poll. Like that's what it is. Now I don't know if there was any kind of like pre-nominated games and you selected them, or whether people just literally went in and voted openly, just typed in a name of a game. Like, of course, Shenmue has roots in modern gaming, open world gaming. Owes a lot to Shenmue. We've spoken here about how much we love the sheer depth of Shenmue's world, the things that it did whenever it was new. You walk into like any room, any building, and it's completely of its own. It's got, NPCs living their own lives, doing their shift patterns. Whether you go to a shop or a travel agent or a mahjong parlor, it's all so detailed and vibrant and alive. So it has had a massive, influence on open world games. But I know what you were talking about, mate, because we obviously mentioned on X about Virtua Fighter. How why that's not on there. And you got a rather angry response from someone saying, well, if you wanted Virtua Fighter on there, maybe you should have voted for it because I voted for Shenmue. What did you vote for? And it's like, but like, this isn't official. Like, okay, it's the BAFTAs, it's a big body, but did every gamer in the world vote? Like, what was the demographic of the voters that voted on this? If you mobilize a fan base to vote for something, then that's obviously the outcome. And the thing that gets me as well, and we've spoke about this on here as well before, is the sheer bitterness towards Yakuza from the Shenmue fan base. We've spoken about it before. Like they almost seem to come across as that they feel that Yakuza has stolen their game's thunder. Like there was even one tweet I seen where someone was saying, did the daft names like, "Hey John, did you see that Shenmue won in most influential game?" And it's like, shh. Once we finish Yakuza 30, blah blah blah, then we'll get to it. And I was like, man, just like the Yakuza games are great for what they are. You know what I mean? It's like, and then I've said that if you want to really see Sega take on Shenmue, why not give it to RGG and just reboot the whole thing, start it over, and do it in the Yakuza engine? No, because then Shenmue would lose its soul if it was in the Yakuza engine. It's like, no. So as I say, I know why people could argue that it's an influential game. Its presence is felt across open world games, but the most influential game, it's not even the most influential Sega game. That's what we're going to get to here.
It is, and I think a key part of that is probably the age and the demographic that were voting on
That
this
is,
sort of stuff. You hit the nail on the head, Mel, when you said, "Oh, it's just people going in and voting for their favorite game." But I think it's a lot of these people didn't actually get the chance to experience Sega at their truly most influential, and that was the time when they were in their arcades. Because I think we can all probably agree that when you were going into an arcade and seeing a Sega game, back in the 90s and the 80s, you were constantly seeing stuff that was blowing you away and that people, other people just weren't doing. And if they were doing it, they were doing it a couple of years later.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's one of the things you really have to remember with anything like this. It's everyone is going to look at it through their own experience. And like you say, you don't know what, the main audience for this was, like who was voting, who knew about it. Did they mobilize people behind them to jump on and vote, their same, choice. I mean, you really don't know, how all of this sort of wraps into, the final choice. And I think Shenmue is one of those games that people look at because at the time it was so big. There really wasn't, when you go back 25 years, there was nothing like that game. Nothing. It did so much that games had never done before. I can definitely see where you would say it was influential. It was influential not just in open world games, but games that had similar things, weather systems and real time clocks that would run the day, and AI that would respond to you a whole bunch of different ways, and they would go and do this during the day and go and do that during the day. And you look at that influence and you would definitely say, yeah, it has an influence on modern gaming. But it's easy to go back and say, well, what about stuff from the 80s? Super Hang On and Outrun, influenced racing games for 20 years. And then Sega picked up that influence themselves and would run with their updates, Outrun 2, Daytona, Sega Rally. I mean, games begot influence with Sega. That's why Sega was so awesome, man, because Sega just didn't influence an industry and then walk away. They influenced the industry, and then they would iterate on that influence, and then it would grow and get bigger. So the influence was just like stepping stones to get better and bigger and more intricate. And that's why Sega was so awesome. And when you look at it on a much larger scale like that, man, there's a lot more games than just Shenmue that Sega has had out there that has influenced the industry as a whole.
100%. Yeah, perfectly said. Because I don't think any of us really begrudge or feel that Shenmue doesn't have an influence, because it did. As you say, it did an awful lot at the time. It was incredible at the time. But if you go back through Sega's back catalogue, and they, like you say, they created games, they created genres, then they introduced contents, and then they iterated on them. And James, from your perspective, when you saw some of these games, when you went to booths back in your youth, you'd see that innovation and that influence just grow kind of in real time as you went past it.
Back in my youth, man. I know I'm 45, man, but come on, that was some fucking shade thrown there. Back in your youth, cheers, mate.
Oh, we all think back in our youth, mate. Come on.
I know, but I don't like to admit it. It's like, come on, man.
You're an old fucker, admit it.
I know, mate. That's it. It's like denying time into it. It's like retro gaming is like a kind of the modern day midlife crisis for most of us 40 somethings into it. It's like,
yep. Holding on to that feeling, man. Holding on to that feeling.
Hanging on with the fingertips, like, come on. Oh. But you were right, Dan. It's like every month or every fortnight or whatever, you would go in, there'd be something new, and you were just always like, they've done it again. It's like, what could they possibly have done this time? It's like everything that they did, like you said, they would create a genre, then. And that's the thing about having the AM teams. The AM teams, like AM2 and AM3, they almost kind of like were influencing each other. So it's like, you do Daytona, we'll do Sega Rally. You do Virtua Fighter, we'll do Last Bronx. It's like, there was just, they were constantly pushing each other internally. And then it was that innovation and that influence within the walls of Sega itself that then transpired onto the industry, and people were still trying to catch up with what Sega themselves were doing. And it's the thing, it's the wealth of Sega's catalogue that's the most astounding. And that's why it's impossible to pick a single most influential game. But I'm looking forward to getting into these kind of games that we're going to pick. I mean, I think we've all got a list of about God knows how many, because the chances are we're all going to go for some of the same ones here. So, but getting into the arcade scene was just wild. Like, as I say, you would get like Daytona, like even like Virtua Racing, and you get like Daytona, Sega Rally, even Sega Touring Cars. the speed that Sega Touring Car ran at was, I'm not saying Sega Touring Car is one of the most influential games, right? I'm just talking about within the genre of arcade. But to see that the pace that ran at was just insane. Then you get Ferrari F35 Challenge in a deluxe cabinet with 3 screens, realistic physics. You can turn on all these assists, like you get in a real car. Like Yu Suzuki's quest for like ultimate realism in a Ferrari had come to pass. He'd taken everything from his love of Outrun and then went, I'm going to make a real Ferrari game, and then just put all the physics in it. And if you play F355, even on Dreamcast, if you turn all those assists off, you need to be fucking good at that game for that to even get off the starting line. It's no, it's insane. So, the arcade scene was such a magical time. It's it's one of those things, if you weren't around to see it and be part of it, it's hard to put into words just how breakneck the pace of innovation was. It was every week, month, it just felt like there was something new, something better, something bigger. And Sega were at the forefront of that.
Brilliant, mate. Yes. So, yeah, as you touched on just now, James, what we thought we'd do is we'll just go through, and I think we've all got our idea of a innovative title, and I don't think we could probably put our hands on and say that this title is the most innovative or influential Sega game, but Sega games that we feel should be in that conversation as the most influential, and we'll go around the table, pick one each, and then we'll discuss. And Mel, obviously, as our guest, I'm going to come to you first. So, what's one of the Sega games that you feel is the most influential to come out of the company?
Like I said earlier, that is a huge question, and you almost have to break it down really by what was the most popular games of that time or that era or that group of years or whatever, because the question becomes so big, it kind of just folds in on itself, where a game can be influential at one point and then not be influential anymore because that genre isn't as popular anymore. I mean, just take Sega's gun games, for example. Sega's gun games just redefined gun games completely. But of course, now gun games have fallen off. And, can you say something like Virtua Cop is super influential today? You really can't. But, when you go back and you look at something, man, really, Daytona USA has to be one of those games where you go, yeah, that was a turning point for the industry, wasn't it? I mean, you can talk about Virtua Racing, but Virtua Racing didn't play anywhere near as good as Daytona. Daytona was the package. Daytona was I don't care if you liked video games or not. Joe Bob would walk into a fucking, Pizza Hut to get a to get a pizza, and he would look over and see a game. He hates video games. He sees Daytona and he's like, wow, that looks really cool. He drops $1 in it to play it. That's what an influential game does, man. It draws people to it. And then it is so successful that everybody around it is like, man, we really have to make a game like that. And the closest competitor you can put to that at the time is something like Ridge Racer. And man, just get the hell out of here, man. Ridge Racer played like shit next to Daytona USA. I'm a Namco fan. I play up Namco. I love Namco, but realistically, Ridge Racer 1 against Daytona, no competition. Daytona looked better. Daytona played better. Daytona sounded better. Everything about Daytona was better. And that game was such a hit in the arcade. It kind of gave the arcades a slight bump, like a slight, rebirth. Like, oh man, we're back. We're gonna make it. Because the game was so popular. And that of course meant Sega was gonna iterate on it. Namco was like, we can do better. So Namco comes out with more stuff, and then you look at the home games that would then come from that. That Daytona had an influence on every home racing game after that, even if it tried to be more realistic. Daytona really was one of those games where people looked at and said, I want to make that, or I want to make that better, or I want to make that different, or I want to take the things that made that game so awesome and I want to make my own version of it. And then, of course, that leads on to Sega Rally, which then Sega Rally influences pretty much every three-dimensional rally game after that. I mean, it's just like I said, it's like these stepping stones where Sega creates Daytona. It looks so much better than Virtua Racing. It plays so much better than Virtua Racing. Everybody starts to realize, holy crap, polygons really mean something. Like polygons are going to change the world. I don't think people looked at Virtua Racing and said that quite yet. They were like, "Oh, Virtua Racing is cool. Virtua Racing is a technical leap." But when people looked at Daytona, they were like, "This is it. This is the future. Everything from here is gonna be 3D polygon racing games, without a doubt." And, that's got to be my first pick. I think Daytona was just one of those games that influenced that genre. And we're probably still feeling the reverberations from it, even in the stuff that's made today in some form.
It's
Yeah.
it's scary when you think though that Daytona had its first Japanese public playtest, in 1993.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, 93, like that must have been like something from the future from people seeing that. Like, if you think about what we were playing in 93 on like Mega Drive or Amiga or, home computers, you were playing nothing that looked like this. And as you said, the pace that it moved at, the level of detail it had, I would wager that anybody, you said, a guy got into his, Pizza Hut or whatever place, arcades were everywhere, grocery stores and train stations back in the day. But you walk in, going about your business, and you see that running. That must have looked like photorealistic to people seeing like that for the first. Again, especially people who maybe weren't passionate about video games or clued up on, Sega, or even frequenters, visitors to an arcade. So it must have looked like, was there some NASCAR on TV? No, I can play that. Really? Daytona was just the impact that it had to see a video game moving at that pace with that level of detail, and not just that, but to play so good. Like the handling on it is just and it's why we love the Saturn port as much as it gets shit on for pop-in and for the low frame rate. Somehow Sega took the absolute essence of Daytona and put it in the Saturn version. Like whenever you nail a power slide on Daytona on Saturn, it feels the same as the arcade. The car's got the weight. You can feel that biting point. No pun intended, car reference, but you can feel that bite point as you're just holding that drift round that corner, and then you can just feel it in your hands. You can feel the moment where it can come off, and go back onto the gas and go back up through the gears, and you can just glide out beautifully. It's just just there's nothing like it, man. It's so good.
It is, and yeah, the influence of it is, pretty phenomenal. I think the early 90s, and I think you said this before, Mel, is that arcades were still just kind of clinging on. They were very slowly dying, but they were dying. But they were buoyed now and again by a single game. In 1991, that was Street Fighter 2, and in 1994, that was Daytona USA. Daytona USA had the same impact on Japanese arcade or on arcades worldwide as Street Fighter 2, and that in itself is a huge influence. And then when you trace that back to, okay, it's almost like I'm sure we'll talk about Virtua Fighter at some point on here, but you can see kind of
Really?
you can see a line where you say, okay, everyone was making games like this, and you had Ridge Racer and you had Virtua Racing, which were kind of, almost tech demos. They were great games, but they were kind of like tech demos. And then you have Daytona, and then you have everything else after, kind of looks like that. how many stock car racing games did you really see before Daytona? And then all of a sudden you get to the PlayStation tech generation, you've got all these Toka games, you've got all these games that kind of ape that way, the way that it looks, the way that it plays. As you say, Mel, you've got ones that go down the simulation route. I wouldn't be surprised if Gran Turismo, probably owes a debt to Daytona USA. Even though in terms of gameplay they're vastly different, but in terms of execution, in terms of replicating a track and a car in 3D, fully texture mapped with that kind of level of gameplay, that DNA of Daytona likely feels into a lot, probably almost all 3D racing games. And then, it's Sega innovated on themselves, and you've got Daytona USA 2 and Scud Race. The list goes on. So, yeah, superb first pick. James, what about yourself, mate? What's Sega's most influential game, or one of, from your perspective?
Well, Mel touched on it, and whenever he mentioned its name, I was going, please don't go deep on this, man, because you're just going to destroy my first choice. And people who know me know what I'm going to go for my first pick, and it is, of course, Sega Rally Championship. I think you talk about what Mel said at the start, you've got games that innovate at the time and no longer innovate. I think when it comes to Sega Rally, like you alluded to, Mel, its force is still felt today. I think if there's one Sega arcade racing game, even alongside Daytona, that resonates so much today, it is Sega Rally. You can feel its footprint in pretty much all modern racing games. You think about rally games, like what rally games, like much like with NASCAR, what rally games were there before Sega Rally? And whenever Tetsuya Mizuguchi decided, to take on Rally, to do something different, and faced with the challenge of taking the sport of Rally, which is a very convoluted sport in terms of you go to a location, you spend 3-4 days there, you drive from that checkpoint to that checkpoint, your car gets fucked midway through, you can do some repairs, you get going again. For Sega to then go, right, we like the premise of that sport, but how can we put our spin on it? And somehow they did it. Like Sega Rally, it feels like a rally game, but it doesn't have the long drawn out nature. Now, of course, Sega Rally would go and influence the likes of Colin McRae Rally on the PlayStation, V Rally, as well. And those games decided to then take Sega's influence and apply that, almost kind of going full circle back on itself by making a realistic rally game where you drive from one end of the country to the other and you mess your car up and you fix it up. So they basically took Sega's influence and applied it to the real world version, because I think deep down they probably knew that A, they couldn't touch Sega Rally in terms of sheer gameplay, and B, that the public in a wider scale were probably looking for a lot more from a rally game than just like 3.5 minutes now. Well, that's the best 3.5 minutes in video game history for me. I could play that 3.5 minutes over and over and over again, and I do. But you even look at games that have come out in modern titles like Dirt Rally. Was it Dirt 4 that was on Xbox as well? Was it Dirt 4? Which I played a shitload on Xbox One X. I think it was the Xbox One X enhanced, and it looked great. Added kind of more wacky events into things as well. So they were still taking the rally formula and still trying to improve on it. But man, Sega Rally just took like the physics engine. Like you had the physics of asphalt, mud, dirt, whatever on each track. And in the arcade, yeah, that felt great with the force feedback wheel, and it was a joy to play. But then Mizuguchi decides, we're going to bring this to the Saturn. And in his words, as we've seen in Nick's video, he set out that he wanted to make Sega Rally on Saturn better than the arcade version. And he did. Now, people go, but the graphics don't look as good and it runs at half the frame rate. Sega Rally on the Saturn is the best version of that game from a gameplay perspective. And that's also why it's got major influence, because it was built from the ground up to show what Saturn could do. It was tailored to that system. And then they bring in Fujimoto to completely rewrite the physics engine. And then you've got this thing where in your hand with a stock D-pad, you can feel those terrains. Like you know how to adjust the pressure you press the D. It's not a pressure sensitive controller, but you know that you've got to press the D-pad a different weight, a different just depth on there to capture the surface that you're driving on to get that optimal driving line. And as I say, that it's just to influence a complete genre and to still be pretty much unsurpassed in that. Like, I love the Colin McRae games on PS1. V-Rally, hate it. Can't stand it. Don't like V-Rally at all. Like, my wife is from like the PlayStation kind of generation as well. Whenever like she heard me like jokingly going, very long, easy ride, she went, oh, V-Rally. And I'm like, no, Sega Rally. It's like, but no, man, Sega Rally's just, its reach, its influence, you know, it did exactly what we said. It took what Daytona had done, you know, AM2 had basically taken Daytona and got the ball and ran with it. AM3 went, no, we're going to take this whole 3D polygonal arcade racer formula and just turn it on its head. And they did, and its force is still being felt today. And for me, as much as, you know, there's more in-depth rally games, nothing comes close to the fun of Sega Rally, especially on the Saturn.
Yeah, very well said, mate. I mean, its influence was almost instant, I think, because it felt like the very next year on PlayStation, you had an army of imitators. You know, you had your V rallies, your Colin McRae's, your Decay rallies. You had ones that even had versions of the Sega Rally logo just tweaked so that they were legally different. But yeah, Mel, what about your thoughts on Sega Rally as an influential title?
Oh, I can't argue against it. It absolutely is true. I mean, Sega Rally was sort of like, Sega has made Daytona and it was like, wow, this is something else. But Daytona's on a hard surface. It's street racing primarily. It's kind of a, a take on stock car racing almost with, grander tracks. And then AM3 comes along and they're like, we're going to take a sport that you never would guess would make a good video game. And they give you something where, as you're playing that game, and I totally see, where the love is coming from here. I could feel it, coming out. You're absolutely right. It's like when you're playing it, it's almost like you can feel like, fuck, the wheels aren't gripping right here. And you can feel that through the controller, It's like, I'm slipping. It's like this, this is going to fuck up my time. That's exactly how you feel. And you feel that through a digital controller. That's gameplay, man. Like, that's the kind of thing that the people that made it, that was raw passion to get that to come out, in, just to make it so that the game felt a certain way. And definitely when it comes to the feel, Sega Rally probably blows away even Daytona. Daytona was perfect with those power slides, if that music blaring, but Sega Rally did take it to another level. Again, it's that iteration thing, man. It's like Sega was almost like, or AM3 is almost like, AM2, you did such a great job, but now we're going to release this. Look at this. And yeah, I mean, I totally agree. Sega Rally, that was when Sega dropped that, it probably, between Daytona and Sega Rally, every developer from that point forward was influenced by one of those two games.
Yeah, they had it covered from both angles, didn't they? Sega Rally almost, targeting the more at the time the realistic handling, and obviously the physics as well. The fact that both of those got their worldwide release in the same year is mind-boggling, and they're so different. Obviously you can Sega Rally was probably influenced a little by Daytona, as pretty much every racing game was. But then to go in that complete different direction and have that much of an influence, astounding. So the first one that I was going to talk about, I was going to go a little bit further back. So this was Sega having an influence by effectively, as far as I'm aware, creating a genre, and that's Space Harrier. Now, you think back to kind of, 1985, they just had Hang On come out. And obviously that was, the scaling on that was unlike anything else that was out there, And I think that Yu Suzuki said that he wanted to beat Namco then. So obviously even way back then, the Sega Namco rivalry was going on. Excuse me. So you had the influence on that had on racing games. But then Space Harrier comes along on kind of a modified hang on board. And all of a sudden, you're not just a motorbike going through, a track. You're a guy. You're able to move all around the screen, but you're also you're flying forward, and you've got these enemies just flying towards you, and they're not just kind of they're this size and then they're this size. You're seeing them in the arcade gradually scale towards you, and obviously the game itself is phenomenal. It's one of my favorite Sega games of all time. And it's one of Sega's most iconic. I think a lot of that comes down to kind of the visuals that still held up extremely well. And you've got the art design. Some of the art design is so out there. But, when you're talking about influence, Space Harrier and Hang On as well, they kind of influenced that scaling technology to be used kind of across the board. And you saw that in more and more games at the time from other developers. You got stuff like obviously there was you skipping a few things because you had things like Outrun as well, which we're talking about influential games inspired by influential games here, because you had Space Harrier and then you had Afterburner, and then Afterburner and Space Harrier. You can really feel that in Starwing or Star Fox on the Super Nintendo, right down to the way that certain stages are designed or music tracks play. You can feel that DNA in there. You had games like Night Strikers, which were clearly influenced by Sega Super Scalers. You had Tato's Chase HQ games and so many more that were inspired by things like Outrun and stuff. And I think a lot of that DNA comes back to Space Harrier. And people were still talking about Space Harrier a decade later, when Panzer Dragoon came out. And I think one of the reviews was, from a gameplay perspective, and Panzer Dragoon is another one that I could probably talk about forever in terms of its influence. But that harkened back to the fact that people said, if you boil the gameplay down, it is a souped up version of Space Harrier. And Space Harrier is still having that relevance 10 years later, and still basically being the kind of the grandfather of the rail shooting genre, a genre which kind of evolved and melded with the gallery shooter to become the modern light gun game with Virtua Cop. But in terms of a rail shooter, you still get rail shooters to a degree now. And all of them, I think, owe a debt to Space Harrier. When you talk about influence, you talk about a monumental game that effectively changed the face of the industry, at least for a time, and created a genre that others tried to slot into. For me personally, I don't think it gets too much bigger than Space Harrier. I don't know what your thoughts on that one are, Mel.
Yeah, Space Harrier was one of those games. I remember when it came out in the arcade, it was special because, before that you had super scaler. They weren't called super scalers at that
Yeah.
time, of course, but Sega had scalers, all the way back to the very early 80s. You can go back and, see those Zoom 909 games, the old Fonzie hardware. I mean, Sega sort of had this trailblazer, again, iterating on itself, man, just constantly improving, constantly making it bigger and better. And we get to the point where, Hang On and Space Harrier come out. And what's so special about that, Space Harrier in particular, is before that, most things were coming at you on the ground, specifically in Hang On. It was the road, it was the signs, it was a tree, it was the other racers. They're like all around you on the ground. But then Space Harrier puts you in the center of the screen, and then you can fly all over yourself with enemies and damage coming at you from every single angle. And to me, that sort of took the shoot 'em up genre and turned it forward and made it a perfect game the first time Sega tried it. It was a forward scrolling shoot 'em up at the end of the day. It was no different than something like, Gradius or something like that. They essentially took that side scrolling shooter, which was on rails itself, and they just turned it forward. And like you say, that inspired a bunch of games after that. So I don't think that's a bad choice at all, even among Sega games. I mean, look at the stuff that came after that, stuff like Galaxy Force and whatnot. Those games were visually more impressive, but you can certainly, tell, Space Harrier influenced that for sure. And then all the 3D rail shooters that would, be born from that. How can you look at that any different than to say Space Harrier influenced all of that as well? And I mean, even among Sega, when they were coming up with in the design phase of the Panzer Dragoon series, that when they were sitting there trying to come up with a Saturn exclusive game, those guys knew damn well what they were doing. They were like, we have polygons to mess with now. Let's make it so you can turn the camera this way and this way. And, but at the heart of it, it's still Space Harrier, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And you say they nailed it out the gate the first time. And it's they didn't quite recapture it with the sequels. So even Planet Harriers, they didn't quite recapture it. But yeah, an absolute classic. James, you were going to say something. Are your thoughts on there?
I mean, my first experience of Space Harrier came on the Atari ST, the version that was look at the two years just. Dan's almost spat his water. Mel's just pity laughing. Mel's just pity laughing at me here. This is like, you poor bastard. It's like, yeah, it was one of the games that was in that big power pack that came with the Atari ST. There was a load of Sega games in there. Hang On was in there, Super Hang On was in there, Outrun was in there, and Space Harrier, which was ported by a British company called Elite Systems.
Yeah, Elite.
And I even looked up a screenshot of it because I remember it had this horrendous, like, kind of vertical bar down the side with a logo and obviously like the Elite logo. But yeah, it's like, look at that, fucking Jesus Christ, man. But the thing about it is that the gameplay, it still kind of resonated. Yeah, it didn't run as smoothly as obviously the arcade version that you would later play, or the home versions later on, like the Saturn version. But it's you can't deny it's fingerprints all over, like Panzer Dragoon. Like you said, Sega sitting there going, we need something for the Saturn. What can we do? And rather than having not just, because that's the thing as well, like with Space Harrier, even though the character's running towards the screen, I think you feel the effect more of the enemies coming at you rather than you going to them. Whereas with Panzer Dragoon, like the difference is I feel like, yeah, the enemies are coming at you, but you're on this big fucking dragon and I'm coming for you. It's like, and the thing is, well, they took the shooting mechanic, because that's the one thing, obviously, you've got like Panzer Dragoon, you can lock on to multiple enemies. Now, obviously, the Sega Ages 2500 version of Space Harrier, you have power-ups and lock-ons as well. So, in a way, that's obviously, when Sega were making that, they've taken influence from Panzer Dragoon, and went back the way and kind of retro-applied it to this, Space Harrier reboot thing. But, man, Space Harrier, like as you say, the different enemy types, like the dragons at the end of the first mission that come at you spitting those fireballs. And obviously you've still got the fact that you're not just trying to dodge and shoot enemies, but you've got trees and pillars and columns and boulders and God knows what and coming at you. Some of them can be destroyed, some of them can't. So you end up running into them and it's like, that sound effect and everything, you get squished. No, it's a great game. As you said, it created a whole genre. Rail shooters definitely still something that's felt today. So great shout, mate.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's you do get the feeling from Panzer Dragoon, it's like, well, how about we make Space Harrier, but instead of shooting the dragons, you ride the dragon. It's and
Aye.
switch that around.
What if we were on that rather than killing it?
Yeah.
We'll make
Obviously,
it.
obviously you get on the, I don't know if you could call it a dragon, but that big furry beast in the bonus stages that knocks all the trees down in Space
That
Area.
that's exactly what I was thinking. I was like, those guys were sitting there and just a light bulb, red off, and they were like, I got it.
Run into the boardroom.
Yeah.
Oh, you just get the feeling that working at Sega and just throwing those ideas around in those days, man, it probably was just them just throwing ideas out there and be like, ah.
Yeah.
The creativity must have been off the scale, man. Like, we've been like throwing ideas at each other like a Wimbledon final, man. Like, it's just crazy.
Yeah.
So Mel, we'll come back round to you then. What's another influential game that you'd like to shout out from Sega?
I hate to do this. I really do.
Where's he going?
Virtua Fighter is unmistakably one of the most influential games Sega has ever created. I mean, let's be real here. I mean, it basically kicked off an entire genre, didn't it? And I mean, it just didn't kick it off, but I mean, how long was it before there was another 3D fighting game that even remotely compared to it? There were years, and I mean, I don't know. Virtua Fighter, for it not to be on the BAFTA list was it was kind of a smack in the face, wasn't it?
Yeah.
It's like, how in the hell can a fighting game that created 3D fighting games, or at least made it so when you walked away from it, it was another one of those games where you said, this is going to change everything. I mean, for the love of God, I mean, even Sony, after they see Virtua Fighter, basically they go to Ken Kutaragi and they're like, dude, we're going to give you everything you need. Make the PlayStation because this is the future of gaming. I mean, in my opinion, Virtua Fighter changed the industry overnight. And, I don't see how anybody could reach any other conclusion than that because we still have 3D fighters. There have been many, many 3D fighters over the years, and it has been around. I mean, when did that game come out? Was it 93?
93 is the original Virtua Fighter, yeah.
Yeah, 93, man. So you're talking, we're talking the game is 30 plus years old. I mean, 30 plus years old. How many games has it influenced? How many, big series have come forward because that game was what it was? For it not to be recognized, even if it was the furthest thing down the list, even if it was the last game on the list, for that game not to be recognized, I really have to question, who the hell was voting for this? I mean, and then you got to go on to, of course, talking about the iteration thing. Look at Virtua Fighter 2. Only a year later, Virtua Fighter 2 comes out and it's textured mapped. It's faster. It's smoother. There's way more moves. There's more characters. There's three-dimensional backgrounds. I mean, the iteration in such a small amount of time. Good God, man. I mean, how is that game not one of the most influential? I mean, if anything Sega has done, I mean, that's got to be like top 3, right? If not number 1. So yeah, I mean, I didn't want to steal James's thunder. I know he's got a passionate, soliloquy coming for us all, but I mean, just dude, Virtua Fighter, Sega comes out with that in the 93. And I think anybody that stood in front of that arcade game walks away and says, everything is about to change.
Yeah, I mean, you're right, Melton. Virtua Fighter is why I'm sitting here. Like, it was the game. I seen it when I was 15 years old at booths in '94. It's like it was the deluxe cabinet, the big rear projection screen, sit down. Like, oh man, there was nothing like it. Like, you couldn't believe the fluidity of movement. Like, these were people. Like, you could feel the weight of the throws. Like, whenever you get thrown over someone's shoulder and they hit the ground, it's like, oh, it's bone crunching. You could feel that there was physics in there, that these felt like actual people fighting each other. As I say, the different fighting styles, the different characters, the way they looked, the way they moved. And I think I've seen people on socials call Virtua Fighter a tech demo. And I'm like, get that shit out of my face. It's like, no. Virtua Fighter, it's the reason why we have the level of 3D humanoid movement in video games, period. Like, Dan, I'll leave you to go into yours, because I know you and I have kind of spoken about this between ourselves on kind of socials, and you always get the odd person who wants to interject and try and correct you on it and use semantics, but you can't ignore Virtua Fighter's reach, not just in the fighting genre, but in video games as a whole. Like, no one had thought that the human body could be animated in the 3D realm the way that it is. Like, Tomb Raider, like, might seem bizarre to think that, well, how could you say that it influenced Tomb Raider? Because the crux of Tomb Raider's whole being is the Lara Croft character model, the way that she moves, the way she traverses, the way that she manipulates the stages and drags objects around, all that humanoid movement, that all stems back to Virtua Fighter. Like you said, Mel, Ken Kutaragi was given the keys to the industry, essentially. They went back running to him and going, whatever you're doing on PlayStation, man, just shelf it, because that's what you need to be trying to replicate. And even at that, you've had your Toshinden and Tekken, none of them came close. You mentioned Virtua Fighter 2. For me, Virtua Fighter 2 comes out on Saturn, late 95 Japan. It was at late 95 US, came out in January 96 over here. It took Sony the best part of 2.5 years to come close, or Namco and Sony, with Tekken 3. Like, people holding up like Tekken 2 to Virtua Fighter 2. It's like, Tekken 2 is a great fighting game, but Virtua Fighter 2, man, it's another level. It was the best performing, looking, playing 3D fighting game in the home for years. It took until Tekken 3 to even lay a glove on it, and I've got a video coming out on Monday at the time we're recording this, called Virtua Traitor, and it's how Virtua Fighter 4 killed a gaming tradition. And I go hard on the PlayStation media for their absolute hypocrisy on this, because, whenever they had like Virtua Fighter as a rival, like, they did everything they could to shit on it because Tekken was so good. And in the minute they got VF4, it's like, wow, Virtua Fighter 4 or Virtua Fighter's great. Here's a timeline of its history. Here's its notable achievements. Like, but you couldn't recognize that shit back then 7 years ago. So it's like, I had some fun making that video. But no, Virtua Fighter, man, its place is undeniable. It's for it not to be on that list. And as we spoke about at the top of the show, people coming to us and going, well, why didn't the Virtua Fighter fans vote for it? It shouldn't be about that. That's the whole point. You shouldn't have to mobilize a fan movement to get a position on a list. The most influential games of all time as a list is pretty easy for anybody who's been around long enough to witness the evolution of video games to put together. Like, another game that should be on there, Street Fighter 2. Why is Street Fighter 2 not on that list? Dear God, it rebooted the entire arcade scene. It's it's madness. It really is. No, Virtua Fighter should be on that list at some point, and anybody who makes a serious list of most influential games who knows what they're talking about will have Virtua Fighter on there.
Yeah, both of you have covered it off so well because I know you said, Mel, saying what is the most influential Sega game is a big question and a very tough question to answer. But when I think about it, when you really boil it down and when you look into like the history and, the timeline of events within the industry at the time, Virtua Fighter really is the game that has more right to call itself the most influential game of all time than almost any other game. And the reason for that is just purely because of the wide-ranging impact it had, not just on it created an entire genre. And the amusing thing is, it created a genre which no one had an answer for a year. It took a year for the first Tekken to go out, and Tekken itself was Namco creating a side-scrolling beat 'em up in 3D, and then looking at Virtua Fighter and saying, "Oh shit, we got to completely retool this." They retooled it. Took them the best part of a year to retool it to get close to Virtua Fighter, and then as you say, Mel, 2 months after Tekken, the original Tekken comes out, Virtua Fighter 2 hits arcades, and it's
Uh-huh.
it's it's unbelievable. But like I was saying when I was talking about Daytona, that you've got that dotted line. You can say, right, you've got this. The industry looks like this. You've got the slow evolution of 2D games, of rasterized pixel games, and then you get to polygons, and there's like that big cut there. And Virtua Fighter is really the game that drove a lot of that. James, you mentioned you knew the bit I was going to talk about was the animation of human movement. Even and people will say, oh, there was 3D characters before. There was 4D sports boxing on the PC that had polygonal characters, but they were just like they were still animated in kind of a traditional way. They looked clunky. They didn't look natural. Even Sega. If you look at the pit crew in the original Virtual Racing, and they don't look natural at all. Namco didn't even bother trying. You got can't remember her name, but the card girl that holds up the race number in Namco. She's a big sprite. She's not polygonal. So people were just like, people didn't know how this stuff was going to work. That's apparent. You look at any 3D game from that era with a polygonal humanoid character, none of them move naturally at all until you get to Virtua Fighter. And then Virtua Fighter is the moment when everyone's like, oh shit, that's how you do it. And then you get stuff like Tomb Raider comes along. Toby Gard has said himself that Tomb Raider was directly influenced by Virtua Fighter. And then you got Tomb Raider on that list, but you don't have Virtua Fighter. John Romero said that when he was trying to think of the sequel to Doom, he wanted to make a game with he wanted to make it with 3D graphics, and he wanted a 3D fighting engine in there. They had to drop the 3D fighting engine, but then ultimately that game became Quake. The team, the Ico team said that the way that Ico moves on a PlayStation 2 game 8 years after the fact was directly influenced by Virtua Fighter. And then you've got the Soul Calibers. Pretty much every fighting game from that point owes a lineage to Virtua Fighter. Street Fighter tried to chase that dragon with the EX games, and then when you get to the Street Fighter 4 games in 2008, they're still on a 2D plane, like a lot of games these days, but they have the sweeping camera angles that Virtua Fighter had. Virtua Fighter pioneered those sweeping camera angles. So it was a seismic shift in the industry that almost happened overnight. It influenced the way games were created, the way that games were designed. It influenced the hardware. The PlayStation is the way it is because of Virtua Fighter. So you put all that together, and then you look at that list, and you just think, why is this game not on there? Not only why is it not on there, why is it not top three? Only behind kind of the likes of maybe Super Mario Brothers, etc. The fact that you've got Shigeru Miyamoto putting his hands on and saying, look, the reason I never made a fighting game is because Yu Suzuki nailed it with Virtua Fighter, and like something to that effect, and that he couldn't touch it, kind of says it all. that's the one of the most influential people in the whole industry giving Virtua Fighter its due. And I don't think it gets any bigger than that. So I'm glad that, Mel, I'm glad that you picked that one and we were able to really just give it. So I knew it was going to take a big chunk of the conversation on here. But, as I was saying, on social media, the fact is that two of those games were directly cited as an influence. Shenmue is the Virtua Fighter RPG. That's how it
That's the
started
worst
off.
thing. You know what I mean?
And Tomb Raider
That's
was
the,
dope.
that's the worst thing that Shenmue started as Virtua Fighter RPG. Like Ryo Hazuki is a reskinned Akira Yuki. Like he's even got the fucking plaster. It's like, but the thing, there's one bit in the Virtua Fighter 1 attract mode, right? And I just think I've always thought it's a complete flex, right? And in the Saturn version, it's missing because they don't have the individual fingers. But see if you watch the attract mode whenever it pans across Akira and he's like that, he goes, see that shit? Like that was just a flex. That was just to show off we've got individual fingers. It's like, I just love it. Love it.
It's a shame they couldn't get those individual figures on the on some of the home ports. I think on 32X, it's just basically a ball.
Yeah.
Aye.
A mitt.
I mean, my next choice, might as well just keep this going because I know Mel picked Virtua Fighter and we did touch on VF2, but my next choice was actually Virtua Fighter 3, and that being more about the impact that had that was still being felt today, not in terms of the genre as a 3D fighter, but in terms of movement, and not in terms of humanoid movement, but 3D fighting games, as much as they took the traditional one-on-one fighting game, they were still restricted to the 2D plane. Virtua Fighter 3 introduced not just the dodge button, which then allowed your character the depth to move in and out, and I know like Guardian Heroes, you could, jump in and out of planes and stuff like that, but this was circling your opponent in terms of dodging left and right. And you also had those undulating stages. Now, I think that's a really something that's sadly missed. I think the fact that fighting games have kind of gone back to a more traditional fighting arena rather than having like you're fighting up like a set of stairs and you can use height advantage and stuff like that. But if you think about Model 3, the level of human movement you had in that, not just that, but facial expressions. Like Virtua Fighter 2, you had mild facial expressions on there, but these were like, remember the Model 3 tech demo for Virtua Fighter 3 that came out, and you pan across Pi in the subway and she scowls at the camera and the eyes, the pupils are, focusing on your movement. Stuff like that was just, again, whenever you seen that, you guys will both remember the first time you seen that, you were like, what the fuck is this? Like, and the exciting thing was, you knew you were going to get to play a version of it on the Dreamcast. A port that I think gets unfairly criticised. I think Genki did a great job of it, done a video on it already. I think it's a great port. VF3TB, you can still tweak it in the settings to play as stock Virtua Fighter 3, albeit, costumes are flipped if you want to fight against the AI in their original VF costumes. You have to pick the second player costume on your character. If you want the VF3 versions of the stages, you can only access them through the versus mode by holding start when you pick a stage. So you can get Jeffrey's original daytime beach scene and stuff like that. But no, the undulating stages, the use of the environment as an actual tool in the fight, like Kage's stage, you're in this temple that's got like rubble on the ground and little steps and a little temple, and you can actually position your fighter to take advantage of those arenas. You look at it, 1996, Virtua Fighter 3 came out, and was it Soul Calibur was 98, and Dead or Alive 2 was a year later, and those all introduced 8-way movement. where you could obviously just freely move all the way around. But that all came from VF3's dodge button because again Sega showed shit. You don't have to just go left and right and up and down. You can circle your opponent. You can position yourself to access a whole new set of moves based on where your body is, just like real martial arts. Like, it's just, it just took everything and changed it. And I think that aspect is what is felt most. The original Virtua Fighter, heralded the whole human movement. VF2, texture mapped, 3D backgrounds, bigger characters, more moves. VF3, the ultimate step in realism and in terms of bringing martial arts movements to 3D fighting games. That's the legacy I think that, is there the most. You see where like VF4, that again, by the time that came out, they were sort of reacting at that point. The arenas are a bit, you can battle damage them like fences and stuff like that. You've got the deformation and snow and sand on the grounds whenever you fight in those areas, which again, you hadn't really seen. Well, Dead or Alive 2 had one stage, was it Ayane stage where you fight in the snow, and that deforms as well. So Sega were kind of more, reacting, I think, with VF4. They were putting things in that like Dead or Alive was doing, Soul Calibur was doing, but VF3 kind of showed them that, no, you don't have to just stick on this 2D plane. You can move around, and I think that is the most long-standing part. You still see that being felt today in modern 3D fighters.
Yeah, it's interesting because I was just thinking, because it's the undulating stages really do have a massive impact in that game. It's a shame that they took them out. But obviously the dodge button was a big thing. I think the original Soul Edge had it in 97, maybe late 96, but I think it still came after. But really, there was a lot that Virtua Fighter 3 did in terms of innovation, and the way that, obviously they took Taka out of VF4, because obviously when you play free and you play Final Showdown, Ultimate Showdown, Revo now on Virtua Fighter, you feel the weight of moving characters, whether they're smaller or if you're throwing Taka around, you can see them like strain to lift them up and stuff when you're doing throws. But it's really the undulating stages that really strike me, and I think are its biggest influence on games. Because I was thinking, when before Virtua Fighter 3 did you see character models really bend their legs, and adjust their frame for them walking up steps or something? Because I'm trying to think, and I think a lot of PlayStation, Saturn, PC games, they just kind of, if you move the character halfway up a stairway, they just still kind of just stood exactly in the same position, like rigid, like a mannequin, but they wouldn't adjust their posture to kind of walk up the steps. Mel, what do you think? That's got to be Virtua Fighter 3's biggest influence, or one of them, right?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, the dodge button, of course, it added that extra dimension there, of course. But the uneven surfaces that you fought on, that is, to me, that's the legacy of that game, because it really did change the way the fight would progress. I mean, you could be in a situation where you were at the top of the steps and your opponent's at the bottom of the steps, and they could come at you from a certain direction where it was difficult to block, because of how they would come at you, because of your position on the ground. And, every single, or at least off the top of my head, most of the stages had some element of that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when you were in the subway, you had the flat area of the ground, but then you had the steps that would lead you up like you were about to leave. And then on the rooftops, the entire roof was slanted on that one. And then, you had the garden where it was sort of like the creek was running through, and like part of the ground was higher here and lower there. And, when figured in that 3D movement that you had with the dodge button, it is true. When you sit back and you play Virtua Fighter 3, it feels radically different from VF2. I mean, VF2, VF2 was sort of the maturation of everything that had started in the first Virtua Fighter. And then Virtua Fighter 3 was like, hey, we're going to take everything that Virtua Fighter has become at this point, and we're kind of going to turn it on its head by giving you these uneven surfaces and this dodge button, which is going to change the direction. And then, as you know, as fighters started to come out, months and years later, they started to use that and expand on that. And basically, again, copy Virtua Fighter. So this goes back to the BAFTA thing, man. Who the hell doesn't put Virtua Fighter on this list? You bunch of fucking Muppets.
It was funny that Mel mentioned the stairs, because the character I hate the most in Virtua Fighter is Lion, right? Especially his jibe, because whenever I first played it, it didn't hurt as much. But see, now when he beats me and he goes, I don't make it a habit to fight the elderly, that shit hits home, man.
Yeah.
Like, especially now. But
I take that personally now.
I kind of laughed at it back in the day, and now it's like it's come full circle, and now I feel like he's mocking me. But no, you just get a position on those steps, man, and he's fucking face is just in the perfect position to double kick him. It's like, have that, you little shit. It's like, that made it all worthwhile for me.
Yeah. So my next choice was one that wasn't on the BAFTAs. Unsurprisingly, obviously Shenmue was the only one that was. And it's a game where I thought, do you know what? This is one of the most influential games that there were. And then I thought, well, hang on, is it? And I started to second guess myself. And I think people do take it for granted a little bit. But that game is not an arcade game. That game is Sonic the Hedgehog, the original Sonic the Hedgehog on the Mega Drive or Genesis. And, when that game launched, it obviously was the showpiece for the hardware. That's the game that really put Sega on the map and put some momentum behind them. But behind it all, obviously, it looked great. But then you look at the momentum-based physics and the way it played, the way that the levels were structured. And I think a lot of platformers back then were really trying effectively to be Super Mario. And the irony is that Sonic the Hedgehog was created to be a rival to Mario by Sega. However, he plays completely differently. And that's kind of why a lot of the time the comparisons don't really stick when people say, oh, why can't Sonic transition to 3D like Mario? I mean, they're fundamentally completely different games. But you saw Sonic come out in 1991, which turned the heads again of the entire industry. Street Fighter 2 was the biggest game in the arcades at the time, but Sonic the Hedgehog was the biggest game in the home in 1991. That's pretty much undeniable. The impact that game had on the industry at that time, at least in the console perspective, was enormous. But then it's not just kind of what Sonic introduced and how he influenced games from a gameplay and design perspective. But I'm sure you both remember the 90s well enough that, when it came to 92, 93, 94, we were absolutely inundated with furry mascot platformers that were just coming from Awesome Possum to Bubsy the Bobcat to High Seas Havoc to they were just non-stop.
Zool,
the ninja from the nth dimension. They were just relentless. So Sonic had that immediate impact where everyone wanted to be Sonic the Hedgehog. He had that influence that, again, like Virtua Fighter to a degree, not quite from the terms of changing the industry from kind of a design perspective, but from the things that he introduced and the way that he was, that he was marketed. He basically changed the industry in that sense. And then you only have to kind of make the dotted line into the 32-bit gen. Naughty Dog were on record as saying, right, we wanted to make a new game, and the thing that we really wanted to make was a Sonic's ass game. So basically Sonic the Hedgehog, but from behind, and then they got Crash Bandicoot. So, and the thing is, those franchises still persist today. So even though it may be, and everyone's like, Sonic's not influential. I think, yeah, he was massively influential, especially at the time. And yeah, those of us that just, you couldn't turn around or look on a game shelf for love of not seeing some sort of furry mascot that was trying to be Sonic back at the time. So yeah, I don't know if that's a controversial one. What are your thoughts on that, Mel?
No, I mean, for a stretch of time, I definitely agree with you. Sonic was definitely influential, there through the early to mid 90s. I mean, like you say, on the Genesis and even the Super Nintendo, hell, even the PC Engine and TurboGrafx for that matter, you saw the influence of those games. And I think you're 100% right when you really look at it. Sonic and Mario are nothing alike. Mario is sort of your true blue platformer, where Sonic is almost like an on rails platformer, where it's giving you a path and you're almost skating down this path to a certain degree, and you're trying to stay attached to the path as it gets more complicated. But Mario is more, it's, you're stopping, you're going to hit this thing over here and look for this thing over there. And then you're going to move on. And then maybe you'll run for a little bit in the stage, but then you're going to slow down because there's this to look for or that thing to get. Sonic, set the standard with that very first stage. It's like you start running and that became Sonic. That became what everybody wanted to do. I think that's why people like me kind of get pissed. The later game of Sonic sort of slows the game down a little bit.
Mm.
And it's like, it kind of pisses you off because it's like, man, it's like, why am I in a water stage? Who decided to put a water stage in the fucking Sonic game? And I didn't want that, but that's another story. I mean, but as far as like, other companies, they were like, holy hell, look at the success of this. The style was so different from Mario. Let's make it about speed. I mean, you can go back and you can see it like in the Tiny Toons game on the Genesis is
Yes.
basically Sonic. The Roadrunner game that came out is basically a Sonic. And then you look around it, the Arrow the Acrobats, the Zero the Kamikaze Squirrel, they're basically Sonic with new gameplay mechanics to try to hide the fact that they're just Sonic. So yeah, I mean, for a stretch of time, I think the original Sonic definitely influenced the industry hardcore. And I think that's why a lot of Sega fans are still left scratching their heads that Sega didn't keep that ball rolling, so to speak, when the Saturn came out. It's like, here you created these games, like, why were you not able to move Sonic into 3D for the Saturn? What happened? What was the breakdown? Because, like you say, you look at Naughty Dog and they're looking at Sonic and they're like, oh man, on rails platformer. Let's turn the camera behind the guy. Let's put him on a path, which that first game was mostly on a freaking path that you couldn't get off of, but it was 3D. How come nobody at Sega came up with that? It's like, are you kidding me? It's like you knew Sonic sold well. He was the face of the company. And then you release a console with no face of your company on it. So yeah, the influence was huge there. It's just a shame that influence didn't seem to extend to Sega itself.
It was the one moment where Sega seemed not to influence itself, which was bizarre given how much we've actually spoken about that's what they did best. But when it came to Sonic, they just absolutely, I don't know, a complete brain fart, man. Just like you say, Naughty Dog basically took it in. Why no one at Sega thought to just do that, rotate the camera? Maybe they felt they couldn't get the speed up going in that direction. I don't know. But Sonic, man, just during the 90s, like you just a glimpse of Sonic was enough to turn your head. Like I used to turn Games Master on. Just like the two games I wanted to see on Games Master were Sonic and Street Fighter 2. Like if I seen even a glimpse of those games on that show, man, I was happy. Absolutely delighted just to see it. But we were talking about like, Sonic and Mario being so vastly different, is that became even more apparent whenever I was watching my wife and oldest daughter playing Super Mario Wonder on the Switch. Now, gorgeous looking game, but you look at the way that moves, right? And it's a lot more meticulous. You know, like there's what's one of the levels that they were playing. You've got to jump in time to a beat,
Yeah.
and with each beat, there's a platform appears. Like, and they spent ages doing this. It's like I get fucking fed up here. Did, and but you know, you look at recent Sonic games. It's like it's just about like we said it was on rails. It's on a path. That's what like Sonic Generations did so well because you just basically you were on this path and you were just blitzing through. You know the old saying in the movie, "Gotta go fast." You know, and that's what you do. And you're switching the tracks and, you know, you're hitting the springs and you've got your lock on targeting and it feels not automated, but it's on rails enough that there's still enough of an element of control where you feel like you are involved enough, but it still captures that essence of speed. And I think that's the only reason I can think why Sonic into 3D on Saturn maybe didn't happen because you know Crash decent enough game but it's a lot slower. It too brings elements of Mario in because it slows the action down, you know, jumping on the crates and getting the apples and the bonus stages. So maybe it's just because they couldn't get the speed up to match the way it was in 2D. So guess what, just fucking make Sonic 4 in 2D then, you know, that would have been an answer. But no, the Sonic 1's just Sonic was everywhere, like in the UK, like just Cyber Razor Cut and all that pirate, you know, Sega Pirate Radio and all that kind of stuff. Like Sonic was a massive part of that whole culture. Like I didn't get to be part of it because I didn't get a Mega Drive. I got fucking Amiga, and I got Zoo. You know, spent all that time with my one button zip stick trying to convince myself while crying in the corner, it's just as good as Sonic. Like, no. And then that came out on the Mega Drive eventually, and you guys must have like played that and went, "Oh, you poor fucks!" Like this is what you got, you know. And he's running about with Chupa Chump lollipops and shit like that. And, oh man! At the end of each level in Sonic, you rescue the animals; they explode everywhere. Whereas in Zool, it was like fucking sweets going everywhere. Like, just what is this, man? No, Sonic's a great shout, man. Again, he's become so big and so ubiquitous now that I think it's difficult to look back at his impact of his earlier games. And he created a whole culture around that console. He was synonymous with Sega, and you know, arguably still is to this day.
Yeah, yeah. You know, I think his popular. I think you've hit the nail on the head. I think his popularity does mean that people, you know, and his recent games mean that they don't give him the reverence in the first game that his influence had. But yeah, even his harshest critic can't say that the Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 and Baldur's Gate 3 that only came out 2 years ago are more influential. But there we go. I think we'll do one more cycle then. So Mel, have you got a third game that has a profound influence that Sega created?
I do. And it's funny that, you know, we're stemming off of the Yakuza series because I mean the Shenmue because in my opinion the Yakuza series has been fairly influential. And I don't think people really realize how long ago that game actually came out. You know, the first one was on the PlayStation 3. What was it, 2005 or something?
The first one, yeah, it's PlayStation 2 actually. The first one.
Oh, yeah, the
That old.
PlayStation 2. You're
Yeah,
right.
it's that old. Yeah.
That's absolutely right. And you know, you go back that far, you realize that's 20 years ago. That's only what 4 years removed from Grand Theft Auto 3. You know, so when the first, you know, Yakuza game comes out, you're sort of you're looking at that and you're saying and you're seeing how it's evolving again, Sega evolving its properties, how it's evolved over the years. Open world games, games that have a lot going on, games that have character interactions, game with deep stories. You're going to tell me that that series hasn't influenced other games over the years? I mean, I realize that, you've got Shenmue. That certainly, was the sort of, you know, the starting point of where that series came from initially. But, Yakuza ended up maturing into its completely its own thing, didn't it? Where it was wildly different in the end than the product that, Sega had developed on the Dreamcast. So I don't know. It's one of those series too where it has so much profoundly deep stuff in it, and at the same time it's silly.
Yeah.
And at the same time it tries to be funny, and at the same time it tries to give you drama. It tries to make you care about characters, and then you hate other characters, and you think this character's funny, but that dude over there, you can't stand his ass, you just want to beat him up. you know there's a lot of emotion involved in the Yakuza series, and I think that that is really its strength, and that world building that Sega has been able to do with that series to be and become what it is. And I don't know, it's kind of one of those games that Sega, in the beginning it really wasn't all that popular here in the US, because like you say, it started back on the PlayStation 2. And then, I mean, how long was it before we actually got a US version that sold well? It was years, wasn't it?
Yeah. Oh, I think the problem with it was that Sega didn't really know what to do with it because
Yeah.
I don't know if you remember the media at the time, Mel, but it really was marketed as Sega's answer to Grand Theft Auto, when really it was nothing of the sort. You know?
Nothing.
So it didn't sell well at all. They brought on this huge cast with Michael Madsen and Mark Hamill and loads of others doing the voiceovers for it.
I
And it
still
was,
couldn't believe it when you told me Mark Hamill was in Yakuza. I was like, what? It's like,
yeah, so it
Yeah.
bombed when it came out, Mel.
Yeah. And I think that's probably why a lot of people initially didn't have the love for the series that it probably deserved. And you're exactly right. It's like if you go into that looking, for Grand Theft Auto, you're not getting Grand Theft Auto. I think that's why a lot of people don't look at Shinju the same way, because a lot of people go into that thinking it's open world, you know, why can't I go and hijack that little kid's tricycle and beat him over the head with it? You've got people wanting and expecting, and man, once those expectations creep into your mind, your opinion of something is almost, broken. It can't be fixed. And like you say, Sega didn't know what to do with it. They didn't know how to market it in the West, and it took it a while for it to catch on. But I think that also shows you how really good that game series was, that eventually it did find recognition because it was so deep and there was so much to do. And again, it's one of those games that just runs you through the ringer with emotions, man. It's like you're so invested in the main character, but then there's so much stupid shit going on around him. You can't help but laugh. And I don't know, man. I think that in terms of modern influence, the Yakuza series probably has a lot more influence on games than you really realize. Because I think some of the humor you see popping up in the Grand Theft Autos over the years has probably been because those guys have played that and been like, okay, what stupid stuff can we throw in here to have a good time with? I mean, I don't know. I think Yakuza is definitely it's a good series from Sega. I think it's more influential than people realize.
Yeah, I think I'd been kind to agree because the it took a while for it to really bed in, like you say, and I think it is because of those preconceived notions of what it was. You know, magazines were saying this is Sega's answer to Grand Theft Auto when you didn't even drive a car in it. People thought it was going to be like Sega's version of the Getaway or something, and Sega in the West were like, well, the fact that they renamed it, the game was Like a Dragon in Japan. They renamed it Yakuza because it's basically like calling your game. It's like Mafia, the game called Mafia,
Yeah.
which kind of obviously the name Yakuza now, as far as the game's title is concerned, it has its own identity. But at the time, it was all right. This is another open world crime sim game like Streets of LA or whatever, or anything like that. But it really is its own thing. And I think it really has had an influence on the way that other open world games are designed. And a lot of that does come from the way that it has fleshed out what is its world. You know, anyone that's played through all the games will know that, you always introduce a new place for you to play in a new sandbox. All of them rooted in reality. They're not quite one-to-one renditions, which in itself is kind of it's almost a Sega Rally way of creating an open world. It distills it into this, smaller space. It doesn't have these sprawling maps that it takes absolutely forever to get across. They're they're not quite Shenmue intimate, but they're intimate enough that you really get a feel and an attachment to everyone that's in there. The places, the characters. By the time you get to Infinite Wealth and then you go back to Camarocho, you're just like, oh, I'm home. You
Right.
get that feeling. And yeah, you're right when you're talking about the way that you've got these character relationships and the way that missions are set up. It adds so much character there. And designers probably don't give as much of the flowers as they should, but you really do get that feeling, especially in later years. That's the way that Shenmue sets up its world. Sorry, Shenmue. Yakuza sets up its world, and the way that it introduces its characters, and the way that it introduces its side missions is quite unlike anything else. Until a point when you start feeling that influence filter through to everything else.
Yeah.
James, you've played a couple of the Yakuza games, haven't you?
Yakuza 0. I need to get my finger out and get through these, man. It's just try to find the time. We're having two young kids, you know, co-run a YouTube channel,
Yeah.
work full time, just life. But no, I need to get time to sit down and play them. But another kind of angle in terms of how influential the Yakuza series has become, it's become as a kind of byproduct influential in teaching gamers of today about Sega's past through the
Mhm.
arcade games, because
Great show.
how many Yakuza players of a certain age know what Fighting Vipers is? You know, Daytona USA, 2 has finally got a home port, albeit arcade. Was it Sega Racing Legends or something it's called?
Sega
Or
Racing Classic, that's it.
Sega
Classic. Yeah.
Racing Classic, it's called, yeah. So it's rebranded, but, it's still Daytona 2. So that's almost become as exciting an announcement as a new Yakuza game. Is what games are they going to put in? My one hope is that Sega, Mr. Utsumi, we are not a retro company, realizes that, wait, we've got all of this amazing Model 3 emulation. People don't want to create random saves on Yakuza just to stand outside the doors to the arcade to play these games. Put them on a damn collection. Like, give us the Yakuza Arcade Club collection. I mean, that would sell. I'm convinced that would sell decent numbers, and you wouldn't even have to put half the work in. You've already got the damn things. You just strip the code out of the Yakuza games and put it in a digital bundle or whatever. It would be easy enough to do, pretty low risk. But the games themselves, I mean, they're, especially the ones on modern hardware, they're really, really polished. Like, the level of storytelling, the voice acting is great on it. Some it's a bit cheesy, dancing away in the karaoke bars and stuff like that. And what was it? What was it I got up to in Yakuza 0? Is it whenever you just start to, you've got to branch out with your kind of business and opening up your bars or your clubs or whatever it is. And I'm like, I was beating the shit out of people 5 minutes ago, and I've got to start this business. It's like, what is this? And then I remember I found a card and it had like a lady on it. And I remember my mate had texted me and says, if you find those cards, do not Google the names on them in front of your wife. was like, right, a bit dodgy. It's like, so, aye, it's got a shitload of charm to it. It almost captures that kind of, Far East kind of B movie vibe, but just enough to keep it serious, but you get enough chuckles out of it as well. But I think the arcade heritage that it's bringing is a key part of why its influence, not just in terms of the genre that it operates in, but its place in kind of history. It's vital. They're almost becoming like kind of miniature Sega museums almost for their arcade games.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah, as soon as you said that, that's exactly what I thought. I was like, that's a great point. It's like these games have almost become a digital museum for Sega's heritage. And, hell, man, maybe that's as good as we'll ever get, but at least we have that. Hell, we could be completely without.
Yeah, at least we get arcade ports of Spike Out, Daytona USA 2, and Ocean Hunters in the most recent one.
That's right.
Boy, what a deep dive that was, boy.
Yeah.
They were just like, what can we bring forward? Let's get Ocean Hunter. It's like,
please tell me deep dive was they meant that pun. Please tell me it was too good.
Admit, I did mean it. I thought it was a little cheesy, but it's like as soon as I started talking, I was like, I gotta do it.
But yeah, just delivered perfectly.
Yeah.
Oh, superb. So, talking of the Museum of Sega, then, James, come back to you. What would you put in this hypothetical museum as one of Sega's most influential games?
Well, we mentioned it earlier during the Space Harrier chat, and there was elements of it that I'm going to bring up here that we didn't really touch on, but I'm going to go for the original Panzer Dragoon. And the reasons for that are not because of obviously the rail shooter element of it, but I can't remember before Panzer Dragoon a video game which was so cinematic in its scope. I think from the minute you booted up Panzer Dragoon and you're greeted with that opening intro, and yeah, you look at it now and it's quite pixely and a bit janky in terms of movement, but back then it was almost like a trailer. It was like a teaser trailer before we even started the game. And obviously you get the kind of fleshed out version when you start the game and you're riding through the desert and you get attacked and you guys, when he's driving, he gets killed and you inherit all these thoughts and things like that. But again, you were going through each stage and you had the music, the even from the title screen, that orchestral score. Every level had a score written specifically for it. It was composed, after the fact. It was composed along with the gameplay, so that it felt like the action on screen, what you were doing on your dragon, was impacting the music. It's a trait that's used in TV, in movie, in movies, where the score is kind of composed around the action already to just grab those moments and make them seem all the more important. But you'd never seen that in a video game before, where the music felt like it was reacting. Like, yourself in that the second stage in the desert, once you went through the little kind of, you go into the cave and the music dies down, it goes do, 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 and it just dies down, and there's little kind of fucking sand insect things are flying out, and then you're weaving your way through, and it's all do 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 do. It's all very quiet, and then as you come out into the light, it's a do 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 do, and that shit just gets you in the feels, man. It pumps you back up because you've got this. You've got some more worms coming out, the big giant green worms coming out the sand, some sand tornadoes left and right. And then you've got that battle with the dragon. But just the way, I'm getting goosebumps, man, talking about it. Just the way that it just sets the scene, like Stage 4, Empire. Oh my God, man. Whenever that and you know you're getting into it's you on a dragon, get into this complex, and there's cannons left and right, and there's fireballs coming at you, and there's the Empire ships, and then you get to the end boss, it's that big transforming robot thing. But just the whole way that game sets the scene, I'd never seen anything so like on that scale, so cinematic in its feel, that the gameplay almost became not second to it, but you became so immersed that you completely lost any sense of the fact you were on rails. And a lot of that's helped by the fact you can turn the camera and look left and right, and there is a degree of maneuverability. On the first stage, those kind of pillars that cross over, you can go under them and swoop back up and all that and position yourself. But at the end of the day, it's still basically an evolvement of Space Harrier, like we spoke about. But just the way that it's presented, it was so cinematic, so dramatic. As I say, you had the teaser trailer at the start. You've got in between every stage, you had little cutscenes that set the story, and it didn't overcomplicate things. It didn't try and, like today, you walk from A to B and you trigger a 15-minute cutscene that really you didn't have to sit through. Oh, hold on, we'll rumble the controller just to pretend that you're still involved. Like Panzer Dragoon, it just told you enough. It set the scene. Like, you see the Emperor's ships mobilizing. They're aware of the dragon. We've got to defend the tower. We've got to stop this thing from getting there. It just, in between every level, it just gave you enough that it motivated you. You felt like you were fighting for something. And I just don't think any game, before then had done that. And its legacy for me is that I think it did show developers that you can use pretty much any genre to tell a story. You don't have to just be an all out and out game. You can merge elements of cinema, of another entertainment medium, into games. And I think we see it today. And I think it's become almost, as I say, detrimental because these cutscenes are like ridiculously long now. But I think Panzer Dragoon just nailed the whole storytelling and especially the music. That music, man, just, so good.
What are your thoughts on Panzer Dragoon as an influential game, Mel?
I imported the Saturn when it came out in Japan. Played Virtua Fighter for months. That's no joke. Loved it. Played it until I got sick of it. Never really got sick of it, but. And then, months into owning the Saturn, a Stall and Panzer Dragoon come out. And they come out first in Japan, and I import them. I had a buddy with me at the time, Nathan, and what we would do is we would kind of gang up on the import, releases. So a Stall is out, Panzer Dragoon is out. He gets one, I get one, and then we just trade the games back and forth. And I had gotten a Stall and he had gotten Panzer Dragoon. And I remember how jealous I was because we got it in the mail. And back then we ordered everything collect on delivery. So the games show up, we got them. We sit down in his house and we watch that opening cinematic. And you have to understand at this point, it's real early in the 32-bit generation. Both of us had owned a 3DO, the year prior. So we were no stranger to, rendered full motion video. But, Panzer Dragoon told that story, didn't it? It was kind of like you saw this, young boy sort of going about his day. This major battle erupts. Guy is killed. He's on the dragon. Off you go. And then it starts telling you a story with its environment and its visuals. And then you're sort of just getting wrapped up into it deeper and deeper. And then that music, man, which to this day I consider the best music that has ever come out of the Sega Saturn, is from that first Panzer Dragoon game. And it's just, you get told a story. And there wasn't a word of English in that game, was there? Not a single word. It was some made up ass language that the developers came up with. You didn't even need that. They could have stripped away every voice, every text in that game, and you still would have come away understanding 99% of that story. And it's just me and my buddy, we sat there and we watched that opening cinematic. It was like, holy shit. And then we get thrust into this shooter where instantly you connect with it and you realize it's like, whoa, Sega has gotten this polygon shooter thing right from the get-go. And then years later, you start to think to yourself of all the trouble that they had moving their properties into 3D. How come all the new shit that they came up with seemed to be just fine? It was like, what happened there? Where was the disconnect? But when we finished playing it that night, we had probably gotten 3/4 of the way through the game before we had stopped playing it. Just that first night, we played it that much, just hours and hours we played it. And then after we were done and we were delirious and we were sleepy and it was early in the morning, we still laid there in the floor talking about it while the cinematic rolled in the background, man, because that's how much of an impact it had on us. It was unbelievable that the Saturn had come out. It was not the first of that generation. It was quite a while after the first of that generation. We had seen plenty of full motion video intros. We had heard plenty of CD soundtracks. We had seen polygon visuals many times by that point. But when you sat and you watched Panzer Dragoon, you had environments that were emotionally felt. It told a story. You had a music soundtrack that went with it. Like peanut butter and jelly, man. You take away that soundtrack from that game, you ruin it. Mm-hmm. And then that gameplay, Sega was able to take a shoot 'em up, turn it from behind, and then give you control over the camera where you looked. And it was perfect. You can't level a single critique against it for a game of that era. I mean, in case you haven't noticed yet, I'm a fan of the first Panzer Dragoon. And, I think it really did set the stage. I think any developer, any creative force in the industry of video games at the time who got to play that in early 1995, you're going to sit there and tell me it didn't influence their thinking, their direction to some extent for a game that strong, that well made to hit that early on the Saturn when the 3DO, the Jaguar, and the PlayStation had been out for months at that point too. Nothing else was like that at the time, man. And I mean, it may not have been specifically on-rail shooters that it influenced, but I think anything that involved shooting from behind with a movable camera angle, Panzer had to have had an influence on it because there was really nothing else like that at that level until then. So, I definitely agree. There's an experience there that if you had it in 1995, you were experiencing something special.
I feel ashamed of myself that it's not on the list because it 100% is. And I've made the argument for it before, and it harkens back to what you've just said so very well, Mel, is that this game, I think, really did have very far-reaching influence across the entire industry. And I think it still has the reverberations of it are still felt today. Now, it's probably passed on via other influences, down the chain over the last 30 years. Well, it's been 30 years since Panzer Dragoon came out. So obviously, initially you had, and I think you can, I think I've said in the video that I did on it, on the retrospective, is that nowhere do I see its influence more than with Sony. Now, in the immediate aftermath of Panzer Dragoon, you see Star Fox 64 comes out, which obviously it doesn't have the rotating camera, but it does have the lock-on shooting mechanism. You can kind of see where Panzer Dragoon has influenced that. But then Sony get Polyphony Digital, their premier own internal development studio, to make Omega Boost. So yeah, I mean, from a rail shooter and a gameplay perspective, definitely, I think it definitely had an immediate influence on the games around it. But then, we're coming back to what you guys are talking about the way that it sets up its world, the way that it creates that orchestral score, the way that there was voice acting in it. Yeah, granted, it was completely made up. But the fact that they went that far to create a new language, it's not Lord of the Rings Elvish by J.R. Tolkien, but it's pretty creative to go out there and make your own.
I
Your
can
own.
I can still hear that opening bit. It's your snooze, my snoo. Our snoo, my snoo. You should have want to you know. It's like they're just so good, man. Just
It's, as I think I said in the video, where before March 1995, did you see a fully polygonal world created with an orchestral score and cinematic visuals voice acted before Panzer Dragoon? And, you know, you look after Panzer Dragoon and then you start seeing, right, well, hang on a second, we're seeing more games with cutscenes done in engine in 3D. We're seeing more games set up their worlds like this. I'd argue that it still has the influence of the modern, unfortunately, it's got to the point, as you say, James, where we're sitting there and we've got 20-minute cutscenes now, and you put the controller on the table while you're waiting for the kettle to boil to make a cup of tea while this nonsense is happening on, just to keep you engaged. But I do think that the structure and the way that it set itself up, and it is at a base level, it wasn't the most innovative game from a gameplay perspective, but I think that works in the way that it influences games downstream because people say like The Last of Us or God of War aren't, they're not pushing any boundaries in terms of gameplay, but what they are doing is pushing the boundaries in terms of cinematics, and that's exactly what Panzer Dragoon did, and it feels like that's the template that Sony saw and just like, yes, let's focus on cinematic games. Let's focus on games that tell the story. Let's create games like Ico and Shadow of the Colossus that have these intricate worlds, scored like movies, voice acting. Ico very much owes a lot of its lineage to Panzer Dragoon when you really think about it. You can see like the way that the voice acting's done, the score is done, the kind of the bleak, the way that the world is set out. So yeah, for me, it's one of the most influential games of its era, which says a lot because there were a lot of influential games at that time. But yeah, it's definitely up there for me.
I think whenever I remember that my uncle registered the Saturn and we get sent this Panzer Dragoon demo disc through, and it gets a kind of cardboard sleeve, and you opened it up, and inside it the kind of black and white picture of the dragon and the rider. It was a bit of kind of spiel about, you are about to experience the world of Panzer Dragoon. Thank you for purchasing your Sega Saturn, blah, blah, blah. But I think the level they chose, that one I spoke about, that second stage, it was the perfect advertisement for that game because like the first level eases you in. It's very nice and slow and weaves and bobs through, and it's not too challenging. But the second stage, it kind of just perfectly goes between the slower bits and then it ramps up the speed in the combat. You don't know what's ahead, and man, the game from there just picks up. Like, is it the fifth stage where you start, you're going down the 3D tunnels, you drop down to your left and right, and the doors are shutting and just enough space for you to angle the dragon
Yeah.
through, and like that is just, every stage just ups the ante. But I think that second stage that they chose for the demo, it was perfection. It just, again, the music I spoke about, just everything about that, it just sold the game. Like it was August that we got it. We didn't get it at launch here. We got it in August, but I had to wait like 6 weeks or so to get it. But oh man, have you got that full game? What an experience is the word for it. Absolutely amazing.
Yeah, easily one of the I think it's safe to say that we're all fans of the game on here, and I think it definitely had a profound impact on the scene at the time. So my last one, funnily enough, it's another rail shooter. So it'd be the third one on the list, but I've got to go with Virtua Cop, the original Virtua Cop, in terms of an influential game. And it's quite funny when you think about a lot of the games that we spoke about on here. Panzer Dragoon, March 95 in Japan, Virtua Fighter 93 in arcades, Daytona USA was 93, 94. This one's also 94. And you know, it's quite easy to say, right, it's just a shooting game. It's probably the game as old as time. Point a gun at the target and shoot. That's the simplest game there is, isn't it? Even they're playing these in the 1800s, weren't they? Back to the Future 3, they've got kind of a a shooting gallery game. But really, it's the way that Virtua Cop sets itself up, as in you are actually walking through these stages, and that in itself, obviously, that was the next step in terms of visuals. You'd had, well, Lethal Enforcers was what, 1 or 2 years before, which in terms of, the way you shoot outside the screen, your six-shot pistol, a lot of similarities between that side of Virtua Cop and Lethal Enforcers. But beyond that, there was nowhere else for it to go but to start going into these stages. And you start going into these fully realized 3D worlds. But then it wasn't just the way that it was setting up, the setting, the scene, the level design and everything, but the fact that it was using that technology that obviously, again, innovating on their own innovations that they'd taken from Virtua Fighter, and the way that the enemies would move, the way that they'd kind of roll around, pop up, hide behind scenery, they'd dodge, roll around. You'd see the civilians running away, and then you shoot them, and then they react based on where you hit them. Hit them in the hand for your justice shot, they drop their gun. Hit them in the chest 3 times, they flip over. Hit them in the leg, and they crouch down. And I don't think it can be understated how much of an impact that had and still has to this day. Because if you talk about it in terms of influence, obviously Virtua Cop is an absolutely phenomenal game. And in terms of direct influence, again, you look at something like Time Crisis, and that is just Namco, much like Virtua Fighter. Namco's like, oh crap, we better copy what Sega did and make our own version of this now. But then you've got GoldenEye, and the GoldenEye story is that the guys at Rare wanted to make their own version of Virtua Cop for the Nintendo 64, but eventually, obviously, a few headaches around. I think it was getting the gun peripherals, what they were going to use the controller, and you can still see a bit of it in the thing in GoldenEye is, again, you get that reaction from the enemies, and you shoot them in certain body parts, and they'll kind of crumple down or react in that specific way. And you can still see that part of the design philosophy when you hold down your, I think it's your Z trigger or your R button when you're playing GoldenEye 64, and you see the target and reticule come out, and that's kind of the game that they were trying to create initially to copy Virtua Cop, but with the 007 license. And then, because I can't remember, was GoldenEye on that list? I can't remember if it was, but people do say that is an influential game. But that influence kind of owes a debt. It does owe a debt to Virtua Cop, and kind of every game that comes since that has that, the way that people react to damage, the way that they react to body shots, etc. Kind of that lineage all goes all the way back to Virtua Cop. And that's why I think, again, it's another one that I think fully deserves the respect that it doesn't get. People kind of brush it off. Yeah, it's just a rail shooter, it's just a gallery shooter, but it really wasn't. It was kind of the first time really that gallery shooters became rail shooters, because you weren't just going left to right, you weren't just shooting targets on a single screen. It was effectively a version of Space Harrier, Panzer Dragoon, where you're going through the stages, albeit blended with a gallery shooter, and then introducing all these new innovations around character impact and the way that characters behave. So for me, yeah, definitely a game that I feel deserves a lot of recognition for its influence.
I think we mentioned about Virtua Fighter and how it influenced like the human movement element, and like John Carmack mentioned he wanted to make like a 3D like, kind of shooting game, and he did that with Quake. I think what Virtua Cop showed, and this may be controversial, I think Virtua Cop kind of paved the way for 3D first person shooters, because you were shown that you didn't just have to kind of, like Operation Wolf and Lethal Enforcers, where you're just a kind of scrolling kind of scene and like one of these kind of like amusement park kind of galleries where like targets pop up and you shoot them and you win a prize. This went on a whole different, angle. You were not just taking part, but you were going through these stages, you were going through these areas. If you were playing with your mate, it was like buddy cop movie kind of vibe on the soundtrack as well. Again, going back to music, Sega's big thing in the 90s with arcades and Sega Saturn, especially music. But at each stage of Virtua Cop was a different like scene. You could almost say they're like three different movies, the way that they're set. The kind of the arms docks kind of warehouse levels, in and out of those kind of containers, and it's the way the camera moves and it weaves and bobs and it's so smooth. You get that bit in the is it the second stage? No, the third stage. You go through the kind of underground car park and there's a little door at the back corner and you go through there. And it's a tight little staircase, but you feel as if your back's against the wall and you're sliding up that staircase, and there's you've got to just kind of keep round, and there's enemies ready to pounce. You've got to be quick on the trigger, and it adds that element of kind of suspense again, maybe borderline cinematic, but it showed that a shooting game didn't have to be solely on rails. I think there was a light bulb moment whenever like companies seen that. It's like, so see what they did with that Virtua Cop, right? What if we kind of take away the whole kind of big targeting reticle and we let the player freely move through these stages? The game's not taking cover for you. You then have to take cover for yourself. You have to use the environments to your advantage. So I know people might look at it and go, oh, it's a genre that's dead now, which is a shame. And I still really wish that someone would make a peripheral or a mod that lets kind of modern screens use the Virtua gun, that didn't cost the earth, because like having to set up a CRT to play Virtua Cop's a pain in the arse when you've got no room to have it permanently set up. But I think its influence is felt in the modern first-person shooter game, because you'd seen nothing like it until Virtua Cop. As I say, you weren't just going through these kind of, bitmap 2D background, scrolling left to right, shooting, popping up targets. And like you mentioned, Dan, the physics on the characters, like there's nothing more satisfying in any, any light gun game than racking up those triple hits in Virtua Cop. That ooh oh, it's like oh. And see if you play with the cursor, it's actually like, I hate justice shots. They feel so unsatisfying, right? It's like, maybe that's the RoboCop fan in me. Just I want to get those triple hits in there. But when you play with the D-pad, yeah, it plays good with the D-pad, but there's a massive disconnect there. And always find like getting the justice shots is just they almost come too easy. Whereas see those triple hits, man, just getting them with a light gun. And I used to one credit clear Virtua Cop on the Saturn on stock settings like regularly back in the day. It's like that outside every, you the wrist motion for that reload. But yeah, I prefer the first game to the second. Dan and I, we've had this discussion. I know you've brought up the first game as an influence because it's the first game. I know as a game you prefer the second because it's larger and branching paths. But I just think the first games get such an iconic look. It's almost like Virtua Fighter 1. And I know VF1's also Model 1 and Virtua Cop's a Model 2 game, but it's like the enemies in Virtua Cop, they're almost, I know they're kind of texture mapped, but they still have that kind of flat shaded look because they've got their suits on and all that. So it's just the way those reticles move and the combination of the way the stages look and the enemies look. It's etched in there. It's just timeless. So it was amazing to see it in the arcade back in the day. It was even more amazing to see it running as well as it did on the Sega Saturn. So yeah, I think it's definitely influenced the modern first person shooter.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought that game up because I think it's to the bigger issue. You have to consider the era and how multiple games influenced the industry together. And multiple games. I think a lot of the games we've been talking about today kind of fit into that for Sega, where Sega had introduced something that hadn't been seen before or hadn't been done as well before. And then people would apply that to other genres. And I think that when you really consider how close Doom and Virtua Cop are in terms of release, certainly the later 90s first person shooters were influenced by both of those games heavily.
Yep. Yep.
I mean, just think about it for a second. First person shooters, Doom wasn't the first person shooter, but Doom did it in such a way that it stood out. It became sort of the de facto experience for a first person shooter. Then not long after, something like Virtua Cop comes along, and it does something from a very similar viewpoint, doing very similar things that weren't in Doom. So then you're going to tell me that the developers of the era, the programmers, weren't looking at games to make in the mid to late 90s and going, I wonder if I took a first person shooter where I could go anywhere in the environment, but I could shoot that dude in the arm or I could blow his leg off. You start to get damage on the enemy that you didn't get in those 2D games. Like, when you opened a door in Doom and there was a zombie, soldier in your face and you blew him away, he just went splat. But now all of a sudden, Virtua Cop has shown you, well, I can shoot this bastard in the leg and he can crumple to a knee and then I can pop him in the head. This is where the games like Soldier of Fortune and GoldenEye, shit like that came from, man, because all of a sudden you're taking that Doom core, you're adding the stuff that Sega was layering in its games. And dude, it got deeper. It went well beyond Virtua Cop because, you got Virtua Cop, which goes to Virtua Cop 2, and then you're like shooting up cars and blowing wheels off of them. Then that moves up to stuff like Gunblade New York, where you got a giant machine gun, where you're just unloading on the city and robots, and the robots are jumping around like crickets trying to get away, and you're just blowing their legs and shit off. I mean, all of that comes to a point where it just starts to meld together, where these games are almost influencing one another, where it's like, I'm going to take this piece of this big influencer, I'm going to take this piece of that big influencer, and I'm going to create this brand new thing over here. And I really think that's important to consider when you're talking about something like what the BAFTA awards just talked about, because I think very few single games can really say they influence the industry on any kind of massive scale. These games were influencing basically the industry together. Again, we go deeper into what would become third person action games, not just the first person shooter like Doom, but we started going behind the character and seeing the character where the very character on the screen itself would take damage. All of that goes back to these groundbreaking games that did things so well, it would influence the next generation of software creators. And I think you're right. Virtua Cop is one of those titles, because I can remember seeing that in the arcade for the first time Me and my friend Nathan were up in DC and we sort of rolled into it. And it was like gun games were nothing new at that point. Like you said, there had been many, many gun games at that point. But all of a sudden, you're able to shoot the gun out of that guy's hand. And he grabs his hand and he's like, and the gun goes flipping away, you know? And then the next guy runs out and you like pop him in the legs, or you get the high shot on him and he flips around and spins up into the air and shit. You never had anything like that before Virtua Cop. And then you started to see that influence pop up in other games. Go just start up something like GoldenEye, run up to the first enemy and start shooting him. You gonna tell me that those fuckers weren't playing Virtua Cop? They was playing Virtua Cop.
Yeah, absolutely. That you can see it in so many modern games. You can see it slowly creep into games at the time. Soldier of Fortune is a great one, and of course, again, Sega influencing themselves, because then you had House of the Dead. It's like, well, how about we swap people for zombies, and instead of like them clutching their hand, you just blow the hand off, you just blow the legs off, and you blow a hole in their chest.
Right.
So,
See, I think as well, like the team behind Virtua Cop, they 100% must have watched RoboCop a good few times, because see that animation where like if you shoot them and they kind of almost horizontally flip, right, and they kind of barrel roll. See if you watch the drugs warehouse scene in RoboCop, and he walks in and he auto targets them all. There's one that he shoots and he literally barrel rolls it. It's like, I'm like, you watched that? They must have done like, and the physics in. And it's just, like Soldier of Fortune. Whenever you said about blowing that bastard's leg off, I was sitting there going, it's Soldier of Fortune. It's like grotesquely brilliant, that game. Unbelievable. Oh, superb. Great choice, mate.
yeah. So that is that. Well, if we include Shenmue, that's 10 influential Sega games that we've discussed, which is pretty good going. Safe to say that Sega had a big hand in influencing the industry, as we already knew. But hopefully our viewers and listeners have got a flavour on here. And Mel, I think there's probably plenty more that we could probably go through, isn't there, if we wanted to do this again?
Oh yeah, I mean, you really have to think. There's probably a bunch of Sega diehards sitting there, like, you assholes didn't talk about Outrun. You know, where's the yeah? It's like, where's the stuff that came out in the early '80s? The first scalers, they influenced the whole thing. I mean, when you don't put something on a list, there's always somebody that wants to come behind you and beat you over the head, man.
There's going to be afterburner fans will be coming after us as well. Like, the fucking cabinet rotated. How could you not? It's like,
yep.
Oh yeah. But we'll one day we might have to do a day two of these. But Mel, been an absolute pleasure to have you on here. Thank you so much for joining us.
Fun as always.
I'm sure all of our viewers and listeners know anyway, because you're Sega Lord X. But for anyone that's living under a rock, where can they find you?
Yeah, I'm on YouTube. You just go to Sega Lord X, man. I'm the only one that came up with such a stupid name, so you're not gonna find anybody else called that. But I most of the stuff I do on Facebook, and that's just because that's the pretty much the lone social media account that I pay any attention to. Not a social media guy, never been a social media guy. But yeah, every so often I'll post something on Facebook, and I've got my videos on YouTube, so check them out.
Absolutely. Anyone that hasn't checked them out really should. But that'll do us for now. Hope our viewers and listeners enjoyed this podcast. Love to hear what your thoughts are around Sega's most influential titles. I'm sure some of you are hopefully giving your thoughts in the comments, in the live chat on the Premiere or on the Radio Sega Discord or on the Sega Guys Discord. If you've made it to the end of the video, please give us a like and subscribe, because that really helps the channel. If you want to be extra mega, think about becoming a member with a bunch of awesome perks from as little as 99p, such as getting your name read out, as James is about to right now.
Certainly, our Akira All Access members for today's show are G-Man, Stiff Peaks, Mikowski, Craig Williamson, Sega Saturn Shiro, Resident SD, P-Wall, Peter 007, Andy Mackey, Nick Tullock, Greg Matthews, David Owens, Tom Fum, Kaiju Leviathan, and Nelson. We've got another one with Nelson Serino, and we have Anthony Riddle, who is now an Akira All Access member. So thank you very much to all of our members and subscribers for your continued support. The journey to 12k is well underway. Hope to get 20 by the end of the year, which would be phenomenal. But no, Mel, thank you once again, mate. I can't believe it's been just over 2 hours we've been chatting. It's always fun to catch up, and let's not leave it so long for next time. And life got in the way a fair bit to getting something organised, but we've got another couple of topics we want to cover off, so let's do this again real soon, mate. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, guys.
Thanks so much for coming on, and viewers, listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. Until next time, we will see you on the Sega side.
Sega!